When you're in an old growth forest, there's this feeling of being in an ancient ecosystem. There's this feeling of massive amounts of life and biodiversity all around you. There's a huge array of species. The trees, obviously, there's 2 or 3 or 4 different kinds of massive mature trees. You can see the difference even if you don't know the specific species names. There's all sorts of different variety of plants on the forest floor. The big trees fall down eventually in the wind, and huge beams of light come through and explode on the forest floor. New plants suck that up. Contrast this with a second growth forest you walk into, and all of a sudden all of these things are gone, right? All of the trees were planted at the same time. They're all the same age. For the most part, they're all the same species. Gone are the huge rays of sunlight, the birds chirping, this explosion of life, and it's just still and quiet and more like a plantation and not like a forest. The fight over old growth forests in BC is nothing new. This is an issue that large parts of the environmental movement were founded on in BC, and the issue the Wilderness Committee was founded on. What we're seeing is tension escalate because in the decades that we've been having this fight, old growth has only grown scarcer. The remnant patches of these forests have gotten scarcer and scarcer and scarcer. Just to get out to them, we have to drive for hours and hours and hours. We usually have to drive far up the slopes of a valley, right? Not right down by the river, not right along the beach. All that was logged before I was born in many cases. And so in 2017, when the current NDP government got elected, they promised to do better on this. A couple years later, they got around to launching the Old Growth Strategic Review, which was the largest forest sector consultation in BC history. They heard from thousands of people in every corner of the province, and the recommendations that came out of that review, delivered to government in the spring of 2020, are quite strong. They called the status quo unsustainable, they called for a paradigm shift, and they made 14 very strong recommendations, including immediate protection for the most at-risk ecosystems. And so government has mapped out the 2.5 million hectares of the rarest old growth forests and said this is our intention to set these areas aside temporarily while we figure out a better plan to manage them. To declare an intention without following up with action is a path to a bad outcome, right? They've marked where these rare forests that they would like to see protected are, but they haven't gone ahead and put limits on logging. And so there are thousands of hectares of this forest, potentially tens of thousands of hectares across BC that have been clear cut. We're standing in one right now, and this is what's at stake. Declarations or commitments or promises without action, that leads to more logging. It's the classic talk and log scenario that has been underway in this province for decades, and we're seeing a continuation of it in BC now. When governments identify and map and make commitments to set aside the most at-risk old growth forests, the most threatened ancient forest ecosystems, without actually putting any limits on logging in the meantime, they continue to fall. Despite the fact that the province has said this is the most threatened old growth forest that exists in BC, despite the fact that they've acknowledged there's so little of it left and that it should be set aside, logging continues. The BC government is not standing up to logging companies, and they are continuing to take the last of these threatened forests. This forest that we're standing in is what an old growth deferral area is supposed to look like. It's still standing, it's still beautiful. This is forest that was earmarked for deferral. The deferral was enacted immediately. This is in contrast with millions of hectares of corporate tenure where the logging licenses are held by major logging corporations, and the BC government did not enact those deferrals immediately. Thousands of hectares of at-risk old growth has been logged. We had to drive for hours to get to this patch of old growth, and it's still here. And it's special. This is why the old growth panel recommended deferrals. to give these at-risk ecosystems a fighting chance, to take a pause and allow for better planning between the government and the title holders, First Nations. And that's what's happening here, but it's not happening in many other places elsewhere across BC. When you get out into a recently clear-cut old-growth forest, there's just it's tough to find the words for that. These are stumps with 1,000 rings on them in some cases. Beautiful trees. Some of the youngest of which are way older than Canada, and they've all been taken. To get to remaining old growth, it's not just driving along a river. For the most part, you have to drive far up the side of a valley. You drive up a river valley that has all been logged decades ago in some cases. There are fields and fields of second growth forest, uniform trees of all the same age. Then you start to wind up the slope. You climb higher and higher. Often cases the roads are being punched through these younger, immature forests, and then they get up into the old growth on the edges of these ridges. And so you're looking down on an entire valley that has been changed by the industry, that has had the original forest removed and has been replaced with these plantations. You're up on the side of the valley where you're in some of the last parts of any given watershed, where there's still original forests and it's being cut. So there's really that sense of loss. You feel it in valley after valley after valley. The most common rationale given for why we need to continue old growth logging is that it creates and sustains jobs. Over the last several decades, thousands of forest sector jobs have been lost, and that's not because we're limiting logging. That's not because we're logging less or we're logging less old growth. It's because the industry, like many, is seeing increased mechanization. It's seeing jobs that used to be done by people replaced by machines. Those jobs are being lost through the industry's own development and their own technological advancements. We're also starting to run out of old growth. There are places that used to sustain massive amounts of old growth logging, and now there's just not there's just not enough old growth in some parts of the coast, in some parts of BC. There's not a contradiction between wanting remaining old growth forest to be protected and wanting forest communities and forest workers to have a good future. When the logging companies come through and clear cut an entire valley, the second growth isn't ready to be cut down again, and so there's no more logging and there's no more jobs in that watershed. By the very nature of the word unsustainable, we're taking away the ability of future generations to do what we're doing right now. Every tree in BC grows on the territory of a First Nation, and the solutions to the old growth crisis must uplift and empower Indigenous people and provide benefits to communities that status quo logging does not. The BC NDP government has promised to protect old growth forests, but there remain major barriers to doing this for First Nations and some rural communities because of the financial benefits that can still be derived from cutting down endangered forests. The problem is that the deck is stacked in favor of continued logging, with revenue and economic benefits offered to communities for cutting old growth, but not for protecting it. The logging industry and the way that resource revenues are shared with communities are set up in a way that makes the choice not to log carry consequences that many communities cannot afford. We need to unstack the deck and make it so that the choice to leave forests standing no longer means choosing to lose out. And the only body with the ability to do this is the provincial government. With support from the Government of Canada, the BC NDP government can properly fund conservation programs and make not logging old growth an option that doesn't hurt First Nations and other communities. This requires spending money, and it requires embracing the idea that the best use of remaining old growth forest is to leave them as they are. With significant, immediate term funding to cancel out any impacts of halting old growth logging, the government can then engage communities on a nation-to-nation basis and get to work determining what the best future is for forests that are no longer being destroyed in the meantime. Secondary investment in an economic future that does not include old growth logging is the second step, enabling First Nations and other communities to build a forest industry around logging some second growth and third growth forests, but also recovering the ecosystems that have been so damaged by 100 years of the corporate logging model. This will take some bravery, but it's also the responsibility of a government that has promised to save old growth forests and promised to double the amount of protected area in this province. This is what's required of the BC NDP, and we all have a role to hold them accountable. The public in BC is passionate about old growth forests and has been for decades. Successive governments and logging companies have done their best to frame this as a complicated issue, but it isn't. The remaining old growth forests in BC are more valuable standing than they are as timber, and it's time to remove the rules that allow and incentivize continued logging of old growth forests. This message needs to be delivered clearly and consistently, again and again, and become a problem that the BC NDP can't look away from anymore. We need all of you to join the movement for old growth forests in any and every way you can. We need to all become a constant thorn in the side of our MLA, talking about this problem and the opportunity to fix it with everyone we can. Supporting local community groups, Indigenous leaders, scientists, and others who are taking a stand against old growth logging in their area. If you're watching this, you have a role to play, and you can be a part of this change. A future where old growth forests stand tall forever, where Indigenous rights are truly respected and upheld, and where we start to heal the relationship between our species and this planet is possible. This is the future we can have together. Let's fight for it.